Tonight, welcome our guest speaker, Gary Fisher. Gary and his extended family have been a part of Flint's history for over 100 years. His great-grandparents, grandparents, dads, cousins, uncles, and aunts worked for GM, and his interests have been with them since childhood. The Boys Under the Hood presentation highlights the lives and stories of local automotive pioneers Durant, Dort, Buick, Chrysler, and others. So please, everyone join me in welcoming Gary Fisher.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it. It's actually a 109-year history now, which is just crazy to me that it's been that long. And I know a lot of this because my wife, who's in the back, is a genealogist, and she's done a lot of research that blew me away, things I didn't know. So it's not like our family talked about a lot of this stuff. We kind of learned it as time went on. So a little bit more from a background perspective. I'm the vice president of the Genesee County Historical Society, and our offices are in the Durant Dort headquarters, which is the ancestral home of General Motors. And so we have meetings in, I just met J. Dallas Dort's great niece, or I guess that's would be his grandniece, right? Which is like unbelievable. It's like meeting one of the Beatles for me. So this is like so cool. I had to get a picture like a fan. I mean, it's awesome. So we are super close to the history. We're right across the street from where GM calls it Factory One, where they tie everything back to all this. So the opportunity to be part of the Genesee County Historical Society has been really just amazing for me, given my family history. But one of the things I wanted to make sure that we did was to tell this story everywhere where people will listen to it, because as you may have heard, Flint has been in the news for other things over the last few decades, and not necessarily the most positive stuff. So I wanted to make sure that we told this story because we feel that this really exemplifies who we are as a city, and in many ways who we are as a region and a state. And the story is just not that well known. So that's a big part of what drives me to do it. And I'm also a financial planner, so I already knew a lot about the economic and the financial side of business because I deal with it all the time. But in terms of putting it into a time and place, it was a different experience for me when I started telling this story to people. And I understood it in a way that I thought other people would benefit from knowing it as well. So that's kind of the context of it. I tend not to use PowerPoint. We didn't know how many people were going to be here tonight, so I do have visuals. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those. The story is really where I want your focus to be. But I do think there's some benefit to see some of the pictures. And when you know the stories, the pictures mean a heck of a lot more. So that being said, if you have questions, given the fact that they're videotaping this and just the way the room is set up, if you could just kind of hold them until the end. And then I don't have anywhere to be except we're going to try to get dinner in downtown Rochester. Other than that, I will stay here as long as you guys have questions, and I'll answer them for you, okay? Fair enough? So let's kind of jump in. So first of all, to understand the perspective that I want you to I think you have to understand and appreciate the story, we need to go back to 1945. And we need to go to a place called Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. That's the end of the Second World War. And, of course, then that's Douglas MacArthur signing the Articles of Surrender on the USS Missouri, and the United States wins the Second World War. Well, there was a fellow named Peter Drucker, who is arguably one of the greatest management consultants in the history of the United States. And Drucker studied General Motors throughout the war. You've probably heard the words arsenal of democracy. I was just in New Orleans at the Arsenal of Democracy exhibit at the National World War II Museum. And I was extraordinarily disappointed to see very little mention of Flint and Detroit and General Motors as part of the deal. And so it was mentioned, but it just, to me, it wasn't mentioned in the way it needed to be. And so back to Peter Drucker. So Drucker's cutting his teeth as this amazing management consultant during the Second World War, and he concludes, his whole study is on how we ramped up our production capacity to compete with the Nazis and Imperial Japan. We were way, way behind them. I think we were the 18th largest standing army, the 13th largest navy. Our troops were training with wooden guns when the war started. There were 6 million men in the Wehrmacht, the German army, 3.5 or 4 million in the Imperial Japanese army. We had, I think, 800,000. So we were and we had a huge movement in the country to keep us out of the war. And that was led by two people, Charles Lindbergh and Henry Ford. And I will say at the Arsenal of Democracy exhibit, they sort of forgot that part about Henry Ford not wanting us to get into the war. So they were very influential people. The country had to sort of warm up to this idea that we didn't have much of a choice but to get into it, but we just weren't ready. And a lot of our resources were going through the Lend-Lease Act to Great Britain and to the Soviet Union to help them out against Hitler. So when we finally got into it as a result of December 7th, 1941 at Pearl Harbor, we were way, way behind the eight ball. So Drucker looked at this and says, what happens to the United States of America without this arsenal of democracy? Well, we don't win the war. We have no chance to win the war, period. We have a very different world we live in now if that would have happened. And he also went on to say that without General Motors, we would have not won the war. We would have not had the arsenal of democracy that we had. So he tied General Motors' existence into a major reason that we won the war. Lots of other companies participated, of course, but according to Drucker and many others, without GM, it just doesn't happen because of the massive, mighty manufacturing capacity. There's actually a book out right now by a guy named Adam Makos. He tells the story of the Pershing Tanks, which were built in Grand Blanc at the tank arsenal there just outside of Flint, designed in Flint at Buick. And the Pershing tanks were the answer to the German Tiger tanks, which were crushing us as we were coming out of Normandy and trying to make our way across Fortress Europe. But the Pershing tanks were there only a few comparably got put into action, but the ones that did stopped the Tiger tanks. And they were designed by Buick engineers, built in prototypes built by Buick people in Flint, and then mass-produced in Grand Blanc. And Makos tells the story of these people that were on the crew, but it was the production of it that had to happen in order for us to even stop the Tiger tanks, which they were just annihilating our guys. So that's just one small bit. You talk about the B-24s and the engines and even little things like we couldn't even put cartridges into rifles. We didn't have the capacity to do that. That had to be figured out, and it was through lots of late-night sessions on Hamilton Avenue in Flint. So General Motors leads the way to do this. So how does that go into this historical discussion of the origins of it? I'm going to start the conversation by saying no General Motors, no arsenal of democracy, no arsenal of democracy, no victory in World War II. Very, very different world right now. So where does it all start? It starts at a place called Saginaw Street in Flint, Michigan. And it starts in 1886 by a guy named William C. Billy Durant. He's this wonder kid. He's a great salesman. He sells cigars, and he sells insurance, and he's got a fire insurance company, and they send him out to sell cigars door to door, and he comes back with an order for 25,000 cigars. He was just a master salesperson. The guy was incredible, young guy, and he was called into action in Flint. Get this, you can't make this stuff up, because they had a water crisis. They did. It's a true story. They had a water crisis. Where's Billy Durant? We need him. They had a water crisis, and people didn't trust the water supply in Flint. So Billy Durant went into action and started making people understand that he was going to fix it. And so they asked him to be on the water board, which he was. Water board meant something different in 1886 than it does now. So he was part of the water board, and he was running late for a meeting at the water board. And his buddy Johnny Alger's coming by Saginaw Street, clop-de-clop, clop. He's on his little horse and buggy thing. And Durant says, "Hey, Johnny, can I get a ride?" He says, "Hop on, Billy, no problem." And Billy gets on this cart, and he's bouncing along, and he says, "Man, this is the smoothest riding cart I've ever been on in my life." And he says, "Well, it's kind of a special thing. I got it in Coldwater, Michigan, at a place called Schmedlin and O'Brien. You ought to check it out." He goes, "I think I will." So Billy the next day takes a train to Coldwater, Michigan, and goes and meets these two kind of old coots, kind of at the end of their career. "Yeah, what do you want, kid?" And he says, "Well, I'd like to be a third partner or an investor in this business. That's the best cart. It had this patented, like a shock absorber. This is the best ride I've ever seen." And Saginaw Street's a bumpy ride, especially back in the day. So he said, "I'll make you a deal, kid. Why don't you buy the whole company? We'll just sell you the whole thing. We'll sell it outright for you." And Durant says, I don't know if I can get the money for that." He says, "But I'll tell you what, let's go to your attorney. We'll make up a deal. If I get the money, we'll sell it. If I don't, give me a few days, we'll call the whole thing off." They said, "Fair enough." They draw everything up, and he makes sure to get a patent signed over to him for that seat, that amazing cushioned seat. Goes back to Flint, and he's like, "What am I going to do?" Now, his family came from some means, but Billy didn't necessarily have a lot of that. His mother did. His dad was a lumber baron, so his family was fairly well off. Billy had certain amount of opportunities, I guess, that a lot of people didn't, but he didn't want to take advantage of that. So he dropped out of Flint Central High School a semester shy of graduating, so he would have what we call in today's day and age street cred. Because having a high school diploma back in that day and age meant you weren't really a hard worker in some way. It's kind of weird, but that was the case. He didn't want to have that black mark on his record that he graduated from high school. He wanted to go to work. So he says, "I'm not a high school grad, but I'm almost a high school grad." He said, "That means I know how to work." And he went to the bankers, and he went to a guy at Citizens Bank named Robert Whaley. And he said, Mr. Whaley, I've got a chance to go into the making of the carts, and I'd like to borrow some money from you if you'd be willing to loan me the money. And he said, Billy, do you think it's a good idea? And he goes, Mr. Whaley, I wouldn't be here if I didn't. And he says, okay, fair enough, I'm going to loan you the money. He walks out onto Saginaw Street. He doesn't know how to build anything. He doesn't know how to build carts. He doesn't know how to build wheels. He doesn't know what he's doing. And he runs into his friend, J. Dallas Dort, your great uncle, which is so cool. And Dort, they're buddies, and he says, hey, Dallas, he says, what's going on? And he says, well, where you been, Billy? I haven't seen you for a few days. He said, I've been in Coldwater. I'm in the cart business now. You want to get into business with me? And Dort says, I'd love to. What do I have to do? You got to give me 50% of the money. He says, I'll get it one way or another. I'll go see my mom in Ypsilanti and get it from her if I have to. Some things never change, right? So he goes back to his mom to get the money, and he comes back and he says, all right, I'm in 50%. Well, they go to the bank, they sign the paperwork, and now they're in business together. And they start learning a lot of lessons the hard way. And the lessons they start learning is about how to build carts, but also how to do business. And there's a guy in Flint, kind of another, veteran of building carts. He owns a company in Flint called the Flint Wagon Works. And the Flint Wagon Works is where it's the #1 producer of these road carts and Surreys and vehicles. And he says, listen, I'll make the carts for you. You guys sell these things. I'll sell them to you wholesale. You sell them retail. So Billy and Dallas are like, great, we don't need a facility. Mr. Patterson will do it. Well, Mr. Patterson says, how's it going? Oh, you're selling them like hotcakes because Billy's an amazing salesman. He goes to Wisconsin. He convinces them to delay the state fair by 1 day so he can get a train to get their road cart with the patented seat from Schmedlin and O'Brien and Coldwater to the fair in Wisconsin. They go, all right, so the first sale was that he convinced them to hold off the judging by 1 day. The road cart shows up. It wins the blue ribbon at the Wisconsin State Fair. And Durant says, and we're going to call it the Blue Ribbon. It's the Blue Ribbon Cart. There we go. Durant and Dort, Blue Ribbon Cart here and they call their company the Flint Road Cart Company. And he sells hundreds of these carts. And Patterson says, so, all right, yeah, it sounds like this is a pretty good deal. He says, who are your customers again? If you just give me the list, I can make sure we get these delivered to them very, very efficiently. So Durant and Dort, being sort of guileless kids at the time, they hand the list over to Patterson, who calls all the customers, quit dealing with these dumb kids. I'll sell it to you at their price. Just buy direct from the source. So Durant and Dort come back and they say, okay, we got to learn how to build these things. Lesson number 1, we got to have a place. So they find an old cotton facility, which now is called GM Factory 1 in Flint. It was never put into use, and so they go, we're going to build our carts here. And they start building these road carts there at what became the Durant Dort offices. But then it was just called the Flint Road Cart Manufacturing Factory, I guess. So let me see. There's the boys right there. Jay Dallas on the left and Billy on the right around the time that they're starting to do this deal. So they start learning, again, some additional lessons. And some of those lessons become things that they just sort of invent. They know that there's a better way to build these things, and they create the first assembly line to build vehicles. Not Mr. Ford. Mr. Ford put it into motion. He didn't. A guy named Speedy Collins did it for Mr. Ford. But it wasn't Ford, and it wasn't Ransom Olds. Ransom Olds was the first one to do it with automobiles, and they'd been doing it in the meatpacking business. But the first person to do it with things that moved people and things around were these two fellas right there in Flint. They also created a thing called vertical integration. They decided, well, if we're going to make it out of wood, we better buy forests. Got to go find some forests. And if we're going to have varnish, we better have a place that we can make the varnish. We better buy linseed oil because that's how you make the varnish and the paint and everything. So they started buying up the various means of manufacturing so that they could control everything and control what they did, because by 1893, they changed the name of the Flint Road Cart Company to the Durant Dort Company, because I guess that sounded fancier, and they were getting older and they needed to upgrade a little bit. And at that point in time, things were changing pretty dramatically for them. They were becoming very wealthy, and Flint, Michigan became the #1 producer of vehicles on the planet Earth. And they put big arches over Saginaw Street that said, welcome to the vehicle city. I even have a friend, Angie, who has a photograph of a sign that says, welcome to Motown. Now, that came later, as you probably learned. But there's a little bit of debate about who was saying they were Motown first. But somehow Detroit owned it, and Flint just said, we're good with being the vehicle city, because vehicles cover all the bases. But at that point in time, we became the vehicle city in Flint because of these two fellas. And they built a nice office, and that's exactly where, in fact, this right here is J. Dallas Dort's office right there, and Billy's office was up at the corner. And that is the Durant Dort headquarters in Flint, which is where our historical society meets, and we have our meetings. It's been restored to its former glory long ago. It's an amazing place. We had an incredible Christmas party. So go to our, was it GeneseeHistory.org, Trace? GeneseeHistory.org is our website. You can see the pictures from the presentations and the Christmas party. It's absolutely amazing. They claim it's haunted. We had a haunted Flint tour, and a medium was there, and she could swear that she heard Billy Durant running up and down the stairs. I'm a little skeptical, but everyone seemed to think it was a lot of fun. But that was their offices, and right at this point in time, they're really getting rolling. They're really sort of taking things to the next level. And that's the remnants of what was the Durant Dort factories. It was a much larger, sprawling complex, but it was torn down over the years, and some of it burned down, and some of it fell down. And that was like everything from a flea market to you name it. It was just in bad shape. And Mark Royce, who's the second in command of General Motors, matriculated at General Motors Institute, which is now called Kettering University in Flint, as did Mary Bauer, who was the CEO of General Motors, as did Stanley O'Neill, who was the CEO of Merrill Lynch. So there's a lot of people that are heavily involved in Flint that went on to do some pretty cool things, that decided that maybe, just maybe, they ought to pay a little homage to their heritage. And so General Motors pumped a bunch of money into Factory 1, which is right directly across the street from the Durant Dort offices there. So all this is going well. Everything's just humming along. Billy and Dallas are millionaires, multimillionaires at the turn of the century. And all of a sudden, one of their workers, a guy by the name of Alexander Brownell Cullen Hardy, or ABC as they called him, who was working for Durant. Durant worked tirelessly. The guy slept 2 to 4 hours a night. He was about 5'4", 120, barely slept, barely ate, was an absolute dynamo as a human being. But he was a nightmare to work for, because who could live like that? He worked nonstop. He took meetings at midnight, 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 5, and he drove people into the ground, including Dallas Dort, whose wife wasn't doing well. He needed to go out to Arizona to kind of recuperate. Durant didn't slow down for a millisecond, but Dallas Dort goes out to Arizona. ABC Hardy takes over for him, and then pretty soon Durant's driving him into the ground. And Hardy says, I need a break. So he goes to Paris with his wife, and he sees an auto show. And he comes back to Billy, and he says, Billy, he said, the horse and buggy thing's over, man. He didn't say it like that, but I sort of think of him saying it that way. He says, the horse and buggy thing's over, dude. Didn't call him dude either, but you get the point. He says, you got to change. You got to change. You got to grow with the times, this horse and buggy thing. And Durant looks him in the eyes, just like all great heroes do, and resists the call to adventure. And he says, no, ABC, ours is a permanent business. And Dallas Dort jumps in, and he says, there will always be horse and buggy. He says, you can put other things next to a horse and buggy, but nothing in front of it. And Hardy says, okay, we'll see about that. And he leaves and goes to build the very first car in Flint, called the Roadster. And the Roadster was a really cool vehicle. But I'll show you that in just a second. But while he's doing that, Durant and Dort's running things, and he kind of convinces Billy that maybe he could go to New York and do some other stuff to get him out of his hair a little bit and try to sort of chill out a little. And Durant can't slow down. He's already mastered vehicles, #1 producer of vehicles in the world. He's the godfather of Flint, one of the most important men in America, #1 salesman of all time. And he thinks, I got to find some new frontiers, and that frontier is right here on Wall Street. And if you notice, there's an office right in the corner here that says J.P. Morgan and Company. And that's where J.P. himself had his office. And you may have heard of this guy. He was pretty successful, still has a company out there, and he actually personally bailed the United States out. Remember our bailout we had in 2009? Oh, we had to bail out AIG, we had to bail out these guys. He bailed the country out. He organized the whole thing. That's how powerful this guy was. And Billy, being a smart guy, says, maybe we ought to know who these people are. So right down the street, literally right there, Billy sets up the Durant Dort brokerage to go to Wall Street and to start learning about manipulating money and funding businesses and how the real engine of capitalism works. While things are humming along back in Flint, Billy's learning how to do that with money, and ABC Hardy is building Flint's first vehicle, first car, first automobile, and that's the Hardy Roadster. It was a beautiful car. That picture doesn't actually do justice. We couldn't find the one we wanted to use on kind of short notice. There's a beautiful red Roadster that Hardy has at the Sloan Museum in Flint, and it's just gorgeous. It was a beautiful car, bright red with brass. If you Google it, I'm sure you can find it at the Sloan Museum. But it was a great car. The problem was an enterprising attorney in New York named Selden had decided that, nobody had patented the internal combustion engine. So he did. And he patented it. And then he sold the patent for $10,000. And then this group of people, the Selden group, went around the country where anyone was selling cars And they'd walk into the dealership, which they had just started, the fledgling dealerships, and say, hey, these are really nice cars. How many of these have you sold? Oh, we've sold 50 of them. We've sold 100, whatever. And there were hundreds of little fledgling makers at that time. So they would, well, can you give me a list of your customers? I'd like to call them and see what they think of the car, because I think I'd like to buy a few of these. Oh, sure, here's their names. And they'd slap them with a lawsuit. You owe us. It was like the mob. $50 per car. That's a lot of money at the turn of the century. And they ran tons of companies out of business, including ABC Hardy. He just couldn't do it. He got slapped with a lawsuit because he handed over his customer list, and that was the end of the Roadster. And he got mad and went to Iowa. He's to return to the story later on, but he leaves, and he says, I'm out. And Durant the whole time is saying, yeah, I knew this car thing wasn't any good. Wasn't going to work. You know, horse and buggy's the way to go. But at that same time, down in Detroit and in Flint, two other guys have different ideas. The guy on the left is David Dunbar Buick. And the guy on the right is a guy named James Whiting. Whiting's in Flint. Buick is in Detroit. Buick was a foreman at a place called Flowers and Company, and there was a guy working for him at the time. They really weren't friends. They didn't really know each other in any meaningful way, whose name was Henry Ford. So Buick and Ford were machinists working at Flowers and Company in Detroit. Well, Buick, while he's there, figures out a way to put porcelain onto metal so that we could have, you know, porcelain tubs and porcelain sinks. And that patent was so important and so crucial. The Germans had figured it out, but it was a closely held trade secret. Nobody else could crack the code until David Buick came along. He partnered with another person from Flowers and Company. Ford departed and did his thing, as we know. And Buick leaves with a guy named Sherwood, and they start building toilet fixtures and tubs, and it's a very successful business. But Buick's vision lies elsewhere. He wants to build engines, and he has his eye on building cars. He's big in the Detroit Yacht Club. He loves learning about the engines, and he thinks there's a future there in maritime use especially. So he is focused on engines, and his partner Sherwood sends him a letter and says either get to work or get the hell out of here. That's what Sherwood writes to him. So Buick says, fine, let's sell the company, I'll leave. They sell the company to Standard, which of course you probably know is a big plumbing company, and they hand Buick some money, and they hand Sherwood some money, and he takes that money, and he goes down to Lafayette and Beaubien in Detroit, still there right now, second floor, you can still see it right at the corner, right up top, right at the intersection there. He sets up shop right down the hall from the Dodge brothers, who are also trying to figure out this car thing. And he starts tinkering with engines. And he just happens to run into a guy named Walter Marr. Walter Marr was a brilliant guy. It was one of these moments where sort of like Stephen Jobs meeting Wozniak and Lennon meeting McCartney. And I mean, you just these things that happen in the world and the universe. And Marr meets him and says, I've got an idea. It's a European design for an engine, but we can make it a lot better, and I think it would be a great engine. It's called the overhead valve engine. And I think it's going to be pretty good. And well, Buick thought it was a good idea too, so they tinkered with it, and they tried to build a car. But they were both the same kind of Scots-Irish temperament, and they were always almost in a fist fight. And at one point, Marr was driving him around in one of the test cars, and it stalled, and Buick gave him hell and just ripped into him, and Marr said, I quit. I'm out of here. You can take your car, and you know what? And Buick charges off, and he's mad, and then he runs into yet another genius by the name of Eugene Richard. There's no agreement whether he was a Frenchman. There's no agreement. One person says he pronounced his name Richard. Another person says he pronounced it Richard. You know, like the Richard, the French way. Either way, it doesn't matter. He was a really bright guy, and he was a specialist in engines. And the engine that he had his eye on was the overhead valve engine. So that's Eugene Richard, or Richard, however you prefer to pronounce it, on the left. And that's Walter Marr on the right. And that's Walter Marr with one of his first cars that he tried to build and produce on his own. He'd been working on bicycles up in Saginaw before he came down to Detroit, and then starts working with Buick. And these guys would go at each other. They'd get back together, and then they'd fight, and then they'd disagree. And then Richard was working at a creamery in Lansing. They went back to work with Buick. They were just always at each other's throats. And then finally, Buick and Marr agree to, like, not fight with each other. And he says, okay, we both agreed, and they put it in writing. If we have a disagreement, we'll just go away, and we'll come back. It was kind of modern therapy, right? They kind of came to this on their own. They thought, okay, we're better together than we are apart. They were really bright guys, but none of them were really good at business, and Buick was burning through all of his money. So while he's in Detroit, a guy named Ben Briscoe, the Briscoe brothers, provided sheet metal to them when he was a plumbing guy, and they thought this car thing might be a neat idea too. Problem was, Buick couldn't make any money, and he couldn't build a car. So Briscoe says, you owe us a lot of money, man. What are we going to do here? He's like, I don't know. You tell me. Tell you what we'll do. We're going to own 99% of your company. You own 1%. If you can make the money to pay us back, we'll give you the other 99% of your company back. And Buick says deal, and he keeps trying to make engines and make cars to no avail. And now Briscoe's freaking out. So he comes to Flint. He runs into a real estate agent by the name of Dwight Stone. He goes, I don't know what we're going to do with this Buick guy. He's a brilliant inventor. He's terrible at business. Terrible. We don't know what we're going to do. We're losing our shirt on this company. And Stone says, you know what? A guy named James Whiting, who was, if we go back right there, he said James Whiting runs the Flint Wagon Works. And he went to a car show in New York. And he thinks cars might be the next, automobiles might, driverless, horseless carriages might be the next big thing. He wants to buy a company. And Briscoe said, how quickly can you introduce me to him? We got to unload this company. So he takes Buick to Flint and introduces him to Whiting. Whiting convinces the board of the company that he works for, the Flint Wagon Works, to buy Buick. And now he's stuck with Buick. The Briscoes, our hands are clean, and they go off to say, we're going to try to figure out how to make a car on our own. And now Whiting and Flint owns Buick. Well, they're burning through money there again. And the banks are loaning them money. And the banks are loaning them more money. And Whiting's starting to freak out. Now all of a sudden they're going, this guy's brilliant, but he's not the guy that's going to take this company anywhere. We're in real trouble here. So now Whiting is on his way to Chicago to a carriage show with another guy named Fred Aldrich, who worked for Billy Durant and J. Dallas Dort. And he says, yeah, this Buick character, brilliant guy, but horrible businessman. We're kind of in trouble. And we owe every bank in Flint thousands and thousands of dollars. And you can almost picture it like if it were in a movie. There's only one man that can save this company, William C. Billy Durant. Yes, you must introduce us to Billy. How can we get to Billy? Well, Billy's in New York. He's running a brokerage right now. He's not all that interested. He hates cars. He wants nothing to do with automobiles. He thinks they're dangerous and dirty and noisy and a bad idea. And he says, but we'll let him run everything. He says, well, we can introduce you to him. So Whiting and Aldrich and all of the crew there, including some of the banking interests, which were family members of Durant, are sort of like, Billy, you think you can help us out? Because we're going to lose there's a lot of money we've given these guys. Because Whiting was a really, really influential guy, and they couldn't believe that he would have made a mistake like this. So Durant comes back to Flint, and he says, all right, let me check it out. He checks it out. He checks the car out. He spends some time, and Whiting and Walter Marr drive back and forth in front of Durant's house on Garland Street in Flint, back and forth, until eventually Durant comes on and goes, all right, what do you want me to buy some of the cars? No, we want you to buy the company. He goes, oh, the company. He says, all right, well, I'll take it over, but I run everything. I'm in charge of everything. And they said, that's not a problem, Billy. So he takes Buick over at this point, November 1st, 1904. And that is the start of everything. That's when things really start to change. And so that's him at the height of his powers. William C. Billy Durant, also called the Wizard or the Wizard of Flint, or the Man. They often just called him the Man. And Durant takes Buick over, and like he did with the blue ribbon carriages, he takes it to a car show. And they have 5 Buicks built, roughly. There's some debate about whether it was 4, 5, or 6. He sells 1,100 of them. Comes back, he goes, okay, we got good news and bad news. What do you want to hear first? The good news. Well, the good news is the Buick's what I call a self-seller. He believed in things that just sell themselves. He said the bad news is we're going to have to figure out how to build them. And they said, okay, well, we better get cracking because 1,100, how are we going to do that? And in the meantime, right before this had happened, Buick's son, Tom, and Walter Marr had taken in Flint, a very famous trip. In fact, my office is in the Mott Foundation building. We'll get to Mott in a minute. And I literally look out my window and I can see where the very first Buick was tested. And it's so cool. It's like a parking lot now and stuff. But I know what happened there. They started in Flint. They drove it all the way to Detroit, and they drove in a big circle to prove that the Buick Model B is what it became, could actually handle the drive, which it did very, very, very well. And now comes Durant and his money, because what he figures out is the reason these guys haven't been able to build a car, yeah, Buick's the wrong guy, but they need money. and I know how to create money out of nothing. And boy, was he smart at doing that. So he went to 5 guys really in Flint. Bishop, a guy named A.G. Bishop, a guy named Ballinger, and a few other people, a couple cousins, and he said, well, you need to kick in some money. We're going to build Buicks. We're going to build these cars here. And they start financing it, and they start issuing stock. And the way stock gets issued, especially back in the day, was interesting. I could say I had assets, and they said, well, you don't really have the assets, but I do. It's a contract. I have an agreement to do business with this other company. That's worth something. And they'd say, well, by golly, it really is. And then what they didn't really worry about was that the other company that had a contract, he owned that too, and he just drafted it up on a piece of paper. So they issued lots of stock. And Durant, being the master salesman that he was, and now knowing how to manipulate money from being on Wall Street, decided he could create a lot of money. And he also knew how to play cities against each other. Because, you can sort of picture him doing this too. He walked around and goes, Flint's great. I'm from Flint. I love you people here. But Bay City, what a city that is. It's on the water. They've got great Polish food here. I really love Bay City. And I'm thinking Bay City's where we should be. So I'm leaning heavily towards Bay City. Oh, unless you have a lot of money for me and give me some land and give me some pretty good tax abatements. That's why I laugh. So, all these tax deals. Been around forever. Durant mastered tax deals. So Flint came out in force and said, oh, no. There was a big editorial in the Flint Journal. There is no place in the United States that makes any more sense than Flint, Michigan, to have this new industry. And there was a lot of truth to that. It had been Indian land with trappers and furriers that got converted into a lumber zone, right? Because we had all the trees. So now you're chopping all the trees down. When that played out, then Flint was amazing at innovation. The next thing was, well, okay, we were trapping and furring, and that went away. And now we have trees, and now that's gone. What are we going to do? Well, we have all these lumber mills, and we have all these people that can work with wood. Why? We can build carriages, which is why it became the vehicle city. And then when carriages were starting to go on the way, what did we have? We had factories and workmen and a great workforce and dedicated people and entrepreneurs and innovators, and that was why the Flint Journal newspaper, including the Detroit Free Press, both said, really, there's no place better in the country than Flint to build these vehicles. And now Durant is in full force. And J. Dallas Dort and the Durant Dort Company become the engine of prosperity behind the Buick Motor Company. They're making sure that they're exerting their influence, they're writing checks, they're owning the stock, and they are on a roll. And everybody's really, really happy. And this Velvet head engine is being constantly innovated by guess who? The same people. David Buick's still around, and Walter Marr still around, and Eugene Richard are still around. And things are humming along. But now Buick starts to fade into oblivion a little bit. He wasn't a good manager. Durant's force of personality is towering over him, and Buick decides that he wants to go and do something else. So he sort of bows out of the company. Marr and Richard stay along, and they introduce a new guy by the name of Arthur Mason into the mix. Arthur Mason is the next innovator, the next person that takes up the mantle of David Buick's to keep improving this engine, and Durant goes completely on a binge of finding talent. In his fold, he has a guy named Nash. And Nash was a cushion stuffer and handled a drill press. He'd been picking fruit. This guy was plucked out of nowhere, and he's just this really hardworking guy. And, of course, he went on to form a company you may have heard of called the Nash Automobile Company, which became American Motors, right? And so Nash becomes another part of this deal. And while Durant's in Boston, he's setting up a national sales network because he'd already done that with his carriages. Now he's starting to do it with the Buick. He runs into this other guy, Albert Champion, who says he's got a better spark plug. And he says, all right, I'll set you up. This is how I would do it. He's come back to Flint, put you in business. We'll call it AC spark plug. And so Albert Champion comes to Flint. And then he's got a couple brothers that race cars. And they're kind of roguish guys. One, Arthur, he makes his chauffeur. The other, Louis, he makes him one of the heads of his racing team, the Chevrolet brothers. So then he hires another guy, Walter Chrysler, to run Buick. And so in Flint, in the same neighborhood, these are the boys under the hood. In the same neighborhood, Durant, Dort, Chrysler, Nash, Marr, Richard, all doing their business together, and Buick is becoming the most successful automobile company in the United States. And then all of a sudden, he gets a call, Billy does, from Benjamin Briscoe, who re-enters the scene. Billy, got to talk to you. How soon can you get to Detroit? I can't make it to Detroit. I'm too busy. Can you come to Flint? I'll meet you. He meets him at the Dresden Hotel on Saginaw Street again in Flint, and he said it's going to be the biggest thing ever. He said, we got to put these car companies together. I've got Henry Ford and Ransom Olds on board with this thing. He said, we'll put it together with my company, which was then called Maxwell Briscoe, and the Buick, and called it the Buick back in the day, and the Buick, and it'll be a conglomerate. You did the same thing with insurance companies, Billy. You know how this works. And Billy said, I did, and I do. who do we get to finance it? That's the question. He said, it's real simple, J.P. Morgan. He says, all right, let's go. So they go to New York, and Henry Ford screws the deal up. He was having mental trouble at the time. He was having back trouble at the time. He continued to change his mind. And on top of all that, he kept changing the deal. So Ford starts to back out of it. And then Briscoe starts running his mouth to the media, which J.P. Morgan really didn't like. And that makes the Morgan people really mad. And then finally Morgan calls Durant. He goes, let me see the Durant guy. Bring him into my office. He says, why do you need this? Why do you want it? This is J.P. Morgan to Billy Durant. And Durant says, Mr. Morgan, he said, one of these days, every American will have a car. Every American will have a garage. We'll have roads that go from L.A. to New York, from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. We'll even have roads that go over the top of one another. There will be no one that doesn't own an automobile. And Morgan says, okay, I'll get back to you. Durant leaves. He goes to his secretary, Morgan does. He said, that man is an unstable visionary. Never let him back in my office again. So that was the end of the conglomerate. Durant comes back to Flint, but because of his research, he's now realized one thing very clearly. If they don't have a combination, as he called it, they're not going to make it. There's too much money needed. There's too much manpower needed. They have to be able to issue much larger chunks of stock to finance this operation. And he doesn't believe Briscoe. He's really mad at Briscoe because he really screwed up by talking to the media, and he's not that big of a player anywhere. Henry Ford's kind of just Henry, and he's off in the corner. And Ransom Olds is left. He's already left Oldsmobile, and he's got the REO Speedwagon that he's promoting at that time. And so Durant gets on a train, and he goes to Lansing. And he goes to Fred Smith, who's now running Oldsmobile, which is not doing real well, but they have a great marketing thing. They had the #1 song in America. It was called My Merry Oldsmobile. And Durant loved the song, and he thought, well, it's all marketing. He said, they have a pretty good car, the Curved Dash Oldsmobile. They have a great song. They just need to update it. So he takes a quick walk through the factory. He sits down with Fred Smith and says, you need me. I need you to do this deal. You're in, right? And Smith went, yeah, I guess we are in. He goes back to New York. He sits down. He renegotiates the deal, and he creates a company called General Motors. And actually, he wanted to call it International Motors, but the Morgan people are kind of back in the periphery again, and they did the deals for International Harvester, so they kind of wanted to keep International Motors in case they wanted to use it. And they said, well, how about General Motors? And Durant said, sure, you can call it what you want. General Motors sounds as good as anything. They incorporate General Motors. He comes back to Flint, and he says, I'm going to build the biggest factory in the world. Biggest factory in the world, the biggest automobile factory anyone's ever seen. I've got a farm called the Hamilton Farm. Bought it to put some stuff for the carriage business on it. We're going to make it a factory, and he did. And he also got a hold of a guy named Charles Stewart Mott, C.S. Mott. Brings him from New York. Mott was a pretty wealthy guy. And he says, I know you make axles for us. He said, so we're going to have you make axles exclusively for us in Flint. We'll put the Weston Mott Company right here in Flint. You want to talk about luck? Mr. Mott had a little bit of luck. Not only did his dad gave him 2 corporations for his 21st birthday. I don't know what you got on your 21st birthday, but you probably didn't get 2 corporations. He did. And then his partner, Mr. Doolittle, shows up in Flint. They were 50-50 and promptly dies. They had a buy-sell agreement, which you didn't see in those days, but they had one because they were very savvy business people, and that made Mott the entire owner of the Weston Mott Company. And Durant not only promises him a factory, promises him complete autonomy, he even says, we'll buy the thing out and give you all the stock, which they eventually did, made Charles Stewart Mott the #1 stockholder of General Motors, one of the richest men in the world eventually, and a very important person in the story. And now Weston Mott has their plant right there in the complex with General Motors, which is bringing all of this talent to run it. Walter Chrysler is now running Buick at this point in time, and they are absolutely humming along. But our plot will thicken a little bit here because that's the Model B right there. That's the one that took the first test drive in Flint, and that is Mr. Charles Stewart Mott on the right and Benjamin Briscoe on the left. So there's the company they created, and as you may or may not know, part of putting that together was bringing all these different companies together, and that was Pontiac, GMC, the truck company, Cadillac, and then, of course, Oldsmobile, and lots of other companies that were put together to form General Motors, and some of them weren't very successful. But he freaks bankers out by doing this. The bankers have a meeting in New York, basically to talk about Billy Durant. And they said, this dude is unhinged. He's out of control. He's got to be stopped. He's growing too fast. Did you see what he did with General Motors? This can't last. This deal will not work. We have to cut him off. Now, that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is a little bit darker. And that side of the story says that they went, hey, this is a pretty good business. Looks like he needs our money to keep doing this. What do you think? Yeah. So what would happen if we cut him off? Well, he couldn't keep making cars. Then what would happen? well, he'd have to come with his hat in his hand to us, and we'd have the upper hand. Those are the two schools of thought. You can decide which one you think happened, because they cut off his funding. No one would loan him a penny, and the company, General Motors, was about to go bankrupt. But luckily, to save the day, an investment banking firm in Boston came along, and they said, we have a deal for you, Mr. Durant. We know you can't get any money, so we're here to help. What we're going to do, now, this is the deal. Tell me what you think about this deal. We're going to loan you $12.5 million. Well, that'll do it. Thank you. That's a good deal. Okay, what are the terms? We'll go ahead and take a $9.5 million fee and commission structure on that. How's that sound? Pretty good deal? Well, he has a gun to his head. He has no choice. He takes the deal. Within 30 days, the company was whole again, humming. The back order of cars were good to go, and they were very profitable. They walked away owning the company, basically. A banker's trust, had a 5-year voting trust. Durant was relegated as an outside player. He was still on the board, but he wasn't in control anymore, and they hauled away with their $9.5 million on the $12.5 million loan. In this day and age, someone might go to jail over that. That was what we would call usury, but it worked. The company stayed in business, and Billy was not happy. So he comes back to Flint, and he grabs Louis Chevrolet. He says, Louis. Now, Louis was 5'10", 210 pounds, which is a pretty good-sized guy in an era when people were 5'4", 5'5", 120, 130. And he was known for being an extremely powerful guy, too. When the crank on those cars would snap back, they would break people's arms. That's why you didn't see smaller people, younger people, women didn't drive those cars. It had to be a guy, and even the guys would snap their arms back. Louis could stop the crank with his hand, so he was a big dude, right? And he was a rough guy, and he always had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and he was a race car driver. He was a big, colorful figure for that era. And Durant knew that if he could have him design the car, there'd be this marketing cachet. He was a brilliant marketer. And Louis says, sure, I'll build your car. He goes, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to put you in a secret garage down in Grand River, down in Detroit, keep it real hush-hush. You build this car. And he goes, why are you building it, Billy? He said, it's real simple. I'm going to crush Henry Ford and take General Motors back from the bankers. And that's exactly what he did. Chevrolet designed the car, but it wasn't the car that Durant wanted. And that didn't make Louis Chevrolet very happy. So even though they created this company, they started not getting along. And Durant really didn't like his behavior. He didn't like the fact that he had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. He said, gentlemen smoke cigars, Louis. And he says, to hell with you, Billy. He said, you own my name, because he bought his name, Chevrolet, but you don't own me, and I'm out. And like Buick, Chevrolet took his meager stock, got rid of it, and walked away from Chevrolet. Billy said, have a nice day. I'm going to make a bow tie, and I'm going to call it Chevrolet. And he saw the bow tie when he was on vacation in Hot Springs, West Virginia with his wife, second wife, Catherine, and it was in an ad for a newspaper for a product called Colettes. And there were little bits of coal that you used to heat a stove with, and they had a little bow tie. And he says, what do you think, Catherine? Wouldn't this be a good logo for the Chevrolet? And she went, sure, Billy, that looks good. And that's the story of how we got the bow tie. So Chevrolet isn't the car that Durant wants. It's too big. It's too fast. He said, I want a car for middle America. I want a car for the average people. We're going to want the Chevrolet to be that car. And it still is to this day, right? Even though trucks cost $70,000, I'm not sure if that's middle class anymore, but you get the idea, right? Most of its history, Chevrolet was for the middle class. So Chevrolet now becomes this really important car. The brand is very popular. A lot of the same people are working on it. Arthur Mason is back involved. Walter Marr, all the same folks are helping Billy put this together, plus a couple other people. A guy called Big Bill Little is involved. Mason is given his own company called Mason Motors, and Durant is making all these moves. And in the midst of this process, he meets Pierre DuPont, who has a lot of money because they were serving, wherever people were blowing people up, they were serving both sides of the deal. That's pretty good work if you can get it, is blowing people up. And if you're an expert at blowing people up, why, you can make a lot of money, especially if there's something like a world war going on. So DuPont has all this money. And their guy, John Raskob, comes to Flint. And what's so funny about like DuPont and Raskob and all these names, if you drive around Flint, all the streets are named after all these people. People go, who is Raskob? Well, that was Pierre DuPont's right-hand man. He says to Pierre, GM is the place to put our money. We have more money than we know what to do with. GM's the place to put it, and Billy Durant's the guy to put it behind. And he's got a really interesting plan to take General Motors back. Now, in the meantime, Billy had suggested that his guy, Nash, be put in charge of General Motors. And so Nash is running General Motors at this point in time, and he's liking it. He's kind of liking this being in charge thing. And Billy doesn't come to the meetings. He doesn't come to the board meetings. And he just stays in the background. Thinking, well, he's doing pretty good with Chevrolet. I mean, he's going to leave us alone, right? Well, not so fast. Billy goes to all the shareholders of General Motors, and he says, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you 5 shares of Chevrolet for every 1 share of General Motors stock. and they took him up on it. Lots of people took him up on it, and he started to collect stock. And with the DuPont money behind him and his own marketing savvy in front of him, he showed up in Manhattan at the 5-year anniversary of the Bankers Voting Trust after they kicked him out, and he walks in and Nash meets him at the door. And he says, Billy, what are you doing here? He says, we don't want any trouble. And Durant says, no trouble. He says, I'm in charge of GM today. He says, you can have a seat. He was a very quiet guy. Like, you're in charge of GM. He goes, well, I thought you might say that. You might question that. So I had all the bellhops come in with bushel baskets full of General Motors stock certificates, dozens of them. And they started dumping them in. And then finally, the bankers went, fine, we'll just take your word for it today. Well, it created what was called a proxy battle. And it was, who was going to be in charge of this thing. And Durant won. So in essence, not in essence, bottom line, Chevrolet bought General Motors. So Chevrolet owned GM, and Billy Durant was back in charge of the company again. And in the midst of all this, Henry Ford comes back to Durant again and says, all right, I want to try to sell you my company one more time. He says, I want $3 million. You ever see Austin Powers? That scene where he says, I'm going to hold the world handsome, for $1 million. And they think that's funny because $1 million is well, $3 million is a lot of money back in the day. And not as much as it would be in a few years for Ford. And Durant says, that's a deal. That's a bargain. I'm going to go ahead and take you up on that deal. And so he talks to his people again, and he comes up with $2 million, but they can't get the last $1 million to buy Ford. And that was the last opportunity to do it, and Morgan shot that one down too. So while J.P. Morgan might have been the smartest man of the 1800s, he'll go down as not the smartest man of the 1900s. And Henry Ford, of course, kept his company, and they kept it to this day. And the guy in the middle there is Mr. Olds. And he sort of, the REO Speedwagon kind of goes, well, it's a band now, right? When you think of the REO Speedwagon, we're not thinking of a car. And then this is the crew that's in place at this point in time when Billy takes the company back over. So at the top, you have Arthur Mason going across the top. Next to him is Albert Champion, the fastest bicycle racer in the world. So Flint, Michigan at that time has the fastest bicycle racer in the world. Next to him is Charles Nash. The guy in the cool leather helmet is Louis Chevrolet, who at the time was the fastest car racer in the world, both living in the same neighborhood, drinking copious amounts of wine and cheeses at their home on Detroit Street in Flint. Down at the bottom is Wally. We called him Wally in Flint. Wally Chrysler. And next to him is Charles Kettering, another brilliant guy that Durant had brought into the mix. Now, a little aside here, just a little aside story to our story. Mr. Champion, AC Sparkplug Albert Champion, had a thing for the ladies, and not necessarily just his wife. So if you were a lady and you were in Mr. Champion's presence, there was a pretty good chance he was going to have a chat with you about an assignation at a later date. The problem he had here at this point in time is that Chevrolet had left Durant, and he was being backed by Champion, who was very, very wealthy and had the AC Sparkplug division and marvelously wealthy because of Durant bringing him into the fold, and he's funding Chevrolet. So Champion figures, well, I can proposition his wife, right? I mean, I'm funding his business, so he propositions Chevrolet's wife, and she sort of says, no, and I'm telling Louis. Now, remember, Louis 5'10", 210. That's like being 6'5", 275. That's like a defensive end in the NFL now. So Louis goes to Champion's office at the GM plant there in Flint on Hamilton, and how do I put this mildly? Beats the hell out of him. Just beats him to death right in the office. The Flint police bury the police report. It's buried to this day. I've tried to see it. I'm still working on that. And it's just done, and they just keep it quiet, and that's the end of the relationship between Mr. Champion and Mr. Chevrolet. Chevrolet goes off to not be very successful financially after that, and Champion stays incredibly wealthy, very, very wealthy, but he's still doing the same thing with the ladies. And his wife figures this out and figures what's good for the goose is good for the gander. While he's in Paris, Albert Champion at a GM meeting with Alfred Sloan, he leaves the meeting early and goes to a Paris cafe where he sees his wife chatting with a very tall American. Now, this American was a World War I hero in France. Champion wasn't because he didn't fight in the First World War. He was in America making all this money, and so he wasn't revered. The American was. He challenges the American to a fight because he's clearly chatting up his bride at this cafe. And let's just say, while he was good at spark plugs, he was terrible at fighting, and he was a little tiny guy, and he gets beat up again by this American. And the French police sort of looked the other way, just like the Flint police did, and Champion limps back to his hotel room. But he didn't just get beat up. He had his chest crushed in the fight, and that led to a heart attack, and Mr. Champion passed away from the fight, so essentially killed in the fight by the American. The French police are like, we're good with it. He deserved it, whatever, have a good day. And that's the end of the story. The Flint Journal wrote it up and said, while on vacation in Paris, Mr. Champion passed away of natural causes. So that's how the newspaper, I will tell you a little aside. So we have a buddy of mine bought his, so all of his stuff went to his brother Prosper's house, which is right off of Court Street in Flint. And Prosper Champion was kind of a hero during the Second World War, too. Very, very important guy for the United States. And all of Albert Champion's stuff goes over to his house. So Prosper gets involved in the Second World War, and he's living there in Flint off Court Street. And while he's involved in this, his son is killed in North Africa during the war. And his wife gets the telegram at the doorstep right there off Court Street and sees that her son died, and she promptly has a heart attack and dies on the doorstep. So when Prosper comes back, it's bad news all around. The house gets sold. It's the end of story. So 2 years ago, a friend of mine pops open his trunk and said, does this mean anything to you? And he has all of Albert Champion's, his cycling shoes, his family pictures, a shoebox filled with Christmas cards from the King of England, the President of the United States, every world leader, every celebrity, all addressed to Albert Champion. And I looked at him and was, yeah, it's probably not worth very much. I'll give you $100 for it. He's like, I don't think so. So he keeps it. And it even had the French photography studio on the back of it where all the pictures were taken. They had been left up in an attic, and as my friend was redoing the ceilings in the house, the plaster, all of the stuff started falling through the ceilings, and it's all of Albert Champion's personal effects that have been kept in Prosper Champion's house. And to this date, my friend hasn't sold them or donated them or done anything else with them, so I'm working on that. But it's a little aside story to the Champion story, which in Flint, nobody really talked about. This story didn't get, none of these stories got talked about. But we're talking about them today, and they're even filming it, so maybe it'll become famous after that. But these guys that built this were regular people, and I think that's the message. In the meantime, Billy Durant had decided that, one of the things he wanted to do was find a trophy wife. And so that trophy wife just happened to be 18. And her name was Catherine. And so Billy, at age 47, went to Catherine's mom. She was a friend of his daughter's. And said, ma'am, Billy Durant, I'd like to date your daughter. She says, I'm going to say no for two reasons. One is you're 47. And secondly, you're married. He went, okay then. All right, fair enough, fair enough. So Catherine later told the story to a friend of mine, Larry Gustin, who wrote the first book on Billy Durant, and it's still the best, called Billy Durant, Creator of General Motors by Lawrence Gustin. Phenomenal book. Lawrence Gustin actually interviewed Charles Stewart Mott, interviewed Billy's wife because she was a trophy wife, much younger, was still alive in 1972. And he said, what happened when your mom said no? She says, well, of course, that meant nothing, and I went to work for Billy at the Dresden Hotel on Saginaw Street in Flint, where she became his assistant, we shall say here. And she did type up a letter to Charles Stewart Mott. She was signed CL for Catherine Lederer, which was what her last name was, bringing him to Flint. So she does factor into the story in that regard. But this is the team that's in place at that point in time as General Motors is consolidating and really changing the world completely. Pierre DuPont's throwing more and more money behind it, and the rest of the story is that they start exceeding the Ford company. General Motors is just the massive 800-pound gorilla, and a lot of it had to do with that money. Now, at this point in time, the story takes another turn. Billy Durant like most heroes do, had a fatal flaw. And it's a fatal flaw that I don't think we can be critical of. He believed that if you invested with him, he owed you. He had your back. He wasn't going to let you lose. He didn't believe in that. He didn't think that was how you treated people. And he would backstop countless times. He would throw his own money into the stock market to correct it, to make the stock whole. He simply wouldn't, what we call now short selling, which was where you sell stock you don't have. He felt it was immoral. There's ways to make money in the market simply by guessing which companies are going to go down. On 9/11, the terrorists did short sales on some airline stocks. And I actually know the guy at the Chicago Board of Options Exchange that stopped those trades from going through because they figured, we'll do some terrorist stuff and we'll make some money at the same time. Well, at this time in America, stock market was uncontrolled, wildly out of control, and the handful of people that were really in charge of it could do whatever they wanted. So a fellow by the name of Joe Kennedy, whose son went on to be a president, and you might have heard of the family, he says to Billy, Billy, you got to get out of this thing. Now's the time to short sell. Now's the time to make money. We're going to make money. We made money on the upside. Now we're going to make money on the downside. Durant wouldn't do it. He wouldn't sell his GM stock. He wouldn't short sell it, and he wouldn't screw his investors. And because of that, his enemies who had vowed vengeance on him for embarrassing them and taking General Motors back, which was never been equaled in the history of American business. Chevrolet bought General Motors. This one guy in Flint took on General Motors, that he created, Buick, then GM, then AC. Oh, and in the meantime, he created Frigidaire. Maybe you've heard of that. He gave that to General Motors. He literally said, yeah, I created Frigidaire. It's a pretty good company and keeps stuff cold. You can have it, GM. That's how Billy's mind worked. And so he's got this flaw, and his enemies know it, and they start short selling the stock. They start flooding the market with the stock, knowing full well that Billy will buy it, which he did, until he became severely overextended and heavily, heavily in debt. And when that happened, the knives came out, and they said, Billy, are you overextended? Well, this is bad for the company. We're going to have to insist that you step down, and we'll make you whole, but you have to move on, and we're just going to go ahead and take over the company now. And in the 1950s, there was an antitrust lawsuit against the DuPonts, and the claim was made that they knew this was going to happen. They engineered it, and they took the company over. It's one of the many stories here that you just sort of have to do your own research and come to your own opinions. Half the people think Durant just, that was his fatal flaw, and they got him with it. The other half think it was a coup, and they kicked him out. But the bottom line was he left, and he had no choice but to leave, and all the while proclaiming that the monetary policies in the country were going to lead to ruin. He leaves. He goes back to Flint. He creates Durant Motors. At this time, Dallas Dort was making the Dort motor car, which I was telling. I just think it's so great that I was just telling Mr. Dort's niece that we had the Dort Motor Car Company come to the Historical Society 2 summers ago, and we had an individual from Sydney, Australia, who flew his Dort motor car in so he could have a picture taken in front of that building I showed you. That's called disposable income, folks. You're going to fly your car in and have a picture taken. So the Dort Motor Car Company was going, the Patterson Car Company was going, the guy that had screwed them over when they were young guys trying to start out, the Whiting, there was a Whiting car at that point in time, but the big ones were, of course, General Motors. So Durant leaves, comes back to Flint, starts the Durant Motor Company, where they produce the Durant and the Flint car, and he becomes known as the Bull of Wall Street. He goes back to his Wall Street roots, and he is the person who is rolling during the 20s. Everyone was coming to Durant to have him help them make more and more money. He was an enormously wealthy individual at this point in time, extremely influential, but he still wouldn't sell stock short. Instead, he went to see President Hoover, and he begged him to change and challenge monetary policy and trade policies. Hoover wouldn't do it. Durant wouldn't short sell. And the rest of the story is that he was driven into bankruptcy, complete bankruptcy, completely out of money, gone. Well, let me back up. In the midst of all that, Mr. Alfred Sloan had taken over the company after Billy was kicked out. Where the workers loved Billy, Alfred Sloan was not unlike Mr. Mott in the sense that he came from a lot of money. He was an MIT graduate in an era where very few people even finished high school, let alone went to college, so he was extremely highly educated. His dad was very wealthy, and he handed him as a gift the Hyatt Bearing Company. They made roller bearings. And so the Hyatt Roller Bearing Company was then sucked up by General Motors, and then Alfred Sloan became the head, the CEO of General Motors. And at this point in time, his view of the workers was, let's just say, different than Billy's. Billy was a man of Flint. Mr. Sloan was a man of extreme wealth. And he viewed the workers in a way that was very different than how Durant did. And the Depression, which of course came in '29 in October, exacerbated that. And the workers that had been given amazing benefits, in a large part by Mr. Dort. General Motors and Buick and the Durant Dort Group had been the forerunners of mutual funds, the Whittier Trust, 401k plans, health insurance plans, stock options. The workers were very, very well taken care of. When the Depression hit, a lot of that went away. The line sped up. The workers weren't treated very well. In fact, the workers were treated very poorly. They were spied on by Pinkerton security. In fact, in some cases, they were murdered. It was even worse at places like Ford, where they hired the mafiosos and gangsters to beat people up. Fomented a lot of racial animosity and riots, and things just generally weren't good, which created an enormous opportunity for a guy named Walter Reuther and his brother Victor Reuther to come in and form the United Auto Workers. And in an effort to get it recognized, they held something in Flint called the sit-down strike, which the sit-down strike changed the game dramatically. We're still dealing with that now. We just had a strike in Flint, and the United Auto Workers, what they did at that time, and they didn't realize, is they became sort of co-owners of General Motors. And regardless of which side of the fence you sit on, they didn't get that. They still felt like, Sloan felt like they weren't. They were just workers. The workers felt they were in charge, but they really weren't, and it created what I call a war. In fact, I'm doing a program on January 30th, Trace, at the Durant Dort called General Motors versus United Auto Workers, the 84-year war. And I think that's the title of it. But in any event, we're going to talk about how this continues on to this day. But Sloan taking over definitely was part and parcel of creating this environment that was very different than the one that Billy Durant had had. And the Depression just took it to an entirely new level. And it changed the game forever for the company. And that's a shot from the sit-down strike, which took place in Flint. The UAW was recognized. It was supported by the mayor, the governor, and the president. The Wagner Act had already taken place in 1937. They paused the fighting during the Second World War, and in the 1950s, that's when the benefits really happened. There was no competition. Germany and Japan were in ruins. There was no competition, and GM was the king of the hill, and they were able to give the union pretty much what they wanted, and never stopped doing that right up until the day that they declared bankruptcy. So that's a whole different story. But that wasn't Durant's story. Durant, on the other hand, was just trying to survive. He literally spent every last penny while these companies went on to be incredibly successful. Remember, he'd given Frigidaire to General Motors. His guy Nash created a very successful automobile company, and Walter Chrysler went on to be extremely successful as well. Some of the innovations, the legacy that was left from what Durant and Dort did, as I mentioned, mutual funds, 401k, stock options, pensions, vertical integration, just-in-time management, the vehicle assembly line, and the notion of consolidation, which just wasn't being done. In the meantime, when he got booted out of General Motors the last time, Alfred Sloan came to Flint. And he goes, I know your guy's been kicked out, but don't feel bad about it. We're building a hotel with his name on it right here in town. Right in downtown, we're going to call it the Hotel Durant. That didn't really make people in Flint feel very happy, but it wound up being where Billy Durant lived, right at the top of the Hotel Durant. Broke as he was, his family was being supported basically on welfare from 4 people: Charles Stewart Mott, Nash, Walter Chrysler, and Alfred Sloan. Primarily because Mr. Mott had said, look, guys, without Billy, we're nowhere. Nobody even knows our names. How can we not help his family out? So every quarter they sent $2,500 to Billy, so his wife could live in a middle class, a little bit better than maybe the middle class lifestyle. And Billy stayed in Flint because he had a briefcase full of cash that the bankruptcy court didn't get, and they also had a little warehouse, the Pomeroy Day warehouse on Detroit Street that his mom had owned, and the bankruptcy court missed that too. So Billy, at this point in time, in his, I guess Billy would have been in his mid to late 70s, decides that the next big thing in America, he's got a pretty good idea what that's going to be. He says it's going to be bowling alleys. Bowling alleys and fast food. Bowling alleys because Charles Stewart Mott would open up his basement where he had a bowling alley at his Applewood estate in Flint, and let the poor kids from the east side of Flint, which is where I grew up, come in, and they could go bowling, and they'd bring their parents, and they could hang out there. He goes, the kids love it, and the parents love it. He goes, I think bowling will be a big thing. He goes, not only that, with 3 shifts working, because this is post-war, with 3 shifts working, everybody needs food fast. If you're working a double shift, you can't go home and cook food. He said, if we could serve a good burger and French fries and a Coca-Cola through a window at a fair price, I think that's the next big thing. He goes, and wait, there's more. We're going to franchise it, take it coast to coast. 10 years before the McDonald brothers in San Bernardino, California, Billy's already identified the next big trend in America. But unfortunately, at this point in time, when he's living at the Hotel Durant, he has a stroke. And as he tells Catherine, he says, Mama, we're not given enough time. So Billy literally ran out of life before he ran out of ideas. And as we know, the rest of the story is that McDonald's and Burger King and Burger Chef and bowling alleys and everything else did become the next big thing. He was significantly ahead of the curve in that regard. And what was even more ironic about this is where the location of it was called the North Flint Recreation Center. The New York Times had a picture of Durant. It said, founder of General Motors serves French fries and rents bowling shoes, which he did. And he rented the bowling shoes to the workers' kids who came into bowling, buy Cokes and French fries and cheeseburgers, and he would cook it, and he insisted on cleanliness and standard of operation. He treated it just like he did Buick and General Motors. And so they would come and kind of laugh and watch this, almost like going to the zoo and seeing something unusual at the zoo, that he invented General Motors and he's cooking me French fries. Isn't that something? And they'd get their picture taken with him. All the while, he just smiled and said, that you'll see. We're going to franchise this, take it coast to coast. It'll be huge. It'll be bigger than anything. It'll be as big as General Motors, you'll see. And he wasn't wrong. He just was older, and he had a stroke. And so Billy wound up not being able to see the rest of his vision, but when he walked out of the North Flint Recreation Center, this is the irony I was mentioning, he would walk out the front, and he would look kitty corner across the street, and there was the General Motors plant, the very first General Motors plant, the Buick plant. There were 80,000 jobs in Flint, Michigan at that time. General Motors with Buick and Frigidaire and Cadillac and Kettering and all the innovations that was happening, none of which happens without Durant and Dort. None of it happens. Zero, none, period. Arsenal of democracy, the middle class, whatever side of the political fence you're on, blue collar, white collar, in between, engineers, union, it doesn't matter. There would have been no sit-down strike if there hadn't been a plant to sit down in. Billy didn't just create the middle class, he reinvented the United States of America in a way that we're all still feeling today. And the mind-blowing part of it is, not only didn't I ever know who this guy was growing up, Larry Gustin, who is mid-80s, grew up in Flint in the 50s, writer at the Flint Journal, became the head of public relations for Buick. When he was growing up, he never heard of him. He had no idea who he was. His name had been erased from the records. Alfred Sloan, to this day, there's a very popular book out called Blue Ocean Strategies. If you go to grad school, I told Andrew, my guy in the back there, he's in college, right, reading stuff for business training. Blue Ocean Strategies, the most unbelievably innovative things you can do in business. And part of the coursework is Alfred Sloan, who created all these bifurcated models. You know, for the middle class, it's Chevrolet. For the up-and-comers, it's Pontiac. For the wealthy, it's Cadillac. A price point for every purse. Alfred Sloan. Billy was doing that with carriages. Alfred Sloan just copied what Billy had done. He created the diamond buggy, the blue ribbon buggy. He had been doing that way before. They say the winners write history. Well, believe me, that's exactly what happened there. His name was wiped out of the record books. Even to this day, I just interviewed a fellow who wrote a book about Charles Stewart Mott. Great guy, great book, highly recommended, except for the part about Billy, where he's described as a wild-eyed dreamer and a carnival barker and all these other things. And I thought, well, how did you get to this? And he said, well, that's where the research led me. And he wasn't wrong, because if you read about Billy Durant, one of the big cable channels had a history of the American automobile, and there was a scene in it where Billy was sneaking around outside of Henry Ford's house, looking in his window to steal. I turned it off. I saw the Will Ferrell movie, with what was it called, Semi-Pro, Andrew, with the Flint Tropics, Will Ferrell, and they're playing basketball in Flint, and Will Ferrell walks into supposedly an auditorium in Flint, and he tips his cap, not to Billy Durant, to Henry Ford. We got up and walked out of the theater. I thought, are you kidding me? It doesn't matter where you go, this poor guy's name is going to be drummed out of history. So I do what I do here in part because he deserves it. He changed the country. He changed the world. He did things that no one has ever done. And interestingly enough, he didn't just dominate the automobile industry. He'd already dominated the carriage business and refrigeration, almost all simultaneously. Hasn't been done before, hasn't been done since. And he also created something that is really personal for me, too, because we went down to Henry Ford Museum. We had lost my mom. My mom passed away suddenly. We took my dad down to Henry Ford Museum as sort of a way to try to cheer everybody up. I mean, he'd always said, he said, I'm so proud of you, son. You went to college. You have a business. I'm so proud of you. I was just a shop rat. In Flint, that's what the guys often called themselves. It was sometimes said derisively about them, but often proudly about themselves. But it wasn't like something that he felt good about. He felt like I did it because I had to. I worked at the factory. My dad worked on the assembly line. He wasn't even a foreman. He wasn't a skilled tradesman. In his own words, he was a shop rat. So here we are, everybody's sad, and we're at Henry Ford Museum, and we're walking around, and we get to the Buick Riviera. It was a 1962 Rivies. And my dad stops there, and he looks at it, and he says, I worked on that. He said, I got hired in 62. He said, that's the first car I built. And he starts telling me all the unique elements of it. We had a problem with the transmission, and we had to do, as he's telling me all this stuff, I've heard it all before, but I'm listening. Yep, I remember that, and it's a beautiful car. And we should get one of these someday, son. We should get one of these. And all of a sudden, this very small woman, this Chinese woman, was standing next to us, and she says, I'm sorry, sir, did you build this car? And he, well, I don't know if I built this car, but I built these cars. And that was the first car I worked on. And my dad likes to talk, which it comes naturally to me, I guess. And he turns and he starts telling her all about the Riviera, all about the Riviera. I had this transmission problem and the steering column. And the whole time I'm thinking, she doesn't want to hear this, Dad. Let the poor lady go about her business. She says, will you just please stay here for a minute? Just please. I'm like, oh, she doesn't want him to follow her and continue to tell. He's got his cane, and he's going, wait a minute, I got to tell you about the rear axle on this thing. So she goes away. My dad says, well, where am I going in a hurry? He's standing there with his cane. And all of a sudden, this large group of Chinese, as it turns out, automobile tourists show up with their cameras and their autograph books. And you'd have thought they ran into, Lennon and McCartney in their prime, or Michael Jordan if you're a basketball fan. They were like, you worked on these? Because in China, the Buick is a revered automobile. In China, the emperors drove Buicks. The reason Buick exists as a brand to this day is because of the amount of money that they make in China. And so these automobile tourists were in America to see automobiles in general, Buicks in particular, never realizing that they could be so fortunate and lucky to find someone that not only worked on Rivieras, but built them and built the first Buick Riviera. So my dad was the happiest we'd seen him since we lost my mom. It was an unbelievably happy day. And the whole way home, he's in the background. And we took my mother-in-law with us, and he's in the back telling me, did you happen to see all those people crowded around me? I don't know if you noticed. But, like, yeah, we saw you, Dad. We had a lot of pictures taken of you. And as we're driving around, I looked at my wife, and I said, here's my dad all these years telling me I'm just a shop rat. You're a financial advisor. You own your own business. And I thought, do you think that when I'm 80 years old, a group of Chinese tourists are going to go, did you sell mutual funds? Did you do stocks? Did you ever sell a life insurance policy? As it turns out, my dad's entire career, which I already had validated the importance of what he did, but now he had proven it on a global scale. And that's why when I talk about Billy Durant, it's not the story of industry. It's not the story of white-collar people or business owners or capitalists or communists and socialists or union people or anybody else. It's the story of all of us. It's the story of how this group of people, I call them the boys under the hood for obvious reasons. They worked under a hood. They designed under a hood. They sold things that mattered under the hood. But they also lived in the same neighborhood. The hood, these were the same, they walked to work together. They lived in this little part of this medium-sized American city, and they changed everything for everybody. And because of that, we damn well ought to remember their names. Durant, Dort, Nash, Mott, Chrysler, especially guys like Walter Marr and Eugene Richard and Arthur Mason, who we don't even know who these people were. But today, at least the people in this room remember them just like the Chinese tourists remembered my dad. And I hope we all remember Billy Durant, because it isn't just about history. As important and as fun as that is to me, it's about the future as well, because the future, the past is prologue. What made Durant and General Motors and Buick successful is what we need more of in this country. Taking care of the people that invest in us, taking care of our friends, providing opportunity, innovation, growth, development, the next big thing, but doing it in the right way. And that's what they did, and that's what we need to remember. So that's the story of the boys under the hood. Thank you. So, I'll take any questions that anybody has. Yes, sir. Yes. It was in an ad for a product called Colette's, C-O-A-L-E. Nope. In fact, there's an actual so Catherine Durant told Larry Gustin, I'll tell you the story. Catherine Durant was interviewed by my friend Larry Gustin when Larry was a cub reporter still at the Flint Journal. He went to New York, he met with Catherine, and he asked that question because there had been all these mythologies about it, and everybody had a different story about where it came from. In fact, the prevailing story in Flint was that it was wallpaper in Paris, right? And so she says, no. She said, I remember it well. We were at a resort in, I want to say it was Hot Springs, West Virginia. I'm almost positive that was the city. And she said, and Billy was reading the newspaper, and he flipped the paper open, and he showed me an ad, and he said, don't you think this would be a really great logo for the Chevrolet? So a researcher whose name I don't remember, somebody with a lot of time on their hands, went to West Virginia and went through every single newspaper from the time she thought they were there until he found the ad for Colette's. And sure enough, there it was, just like she said it was, and it was a bow tie. So it had said Colette's right across the midsection of the bow tie. And he turned it into Chevrolet, exactly. Yeah. Yes, sir. 1920. Yeah, it could have been officially 21, but it was shortly thereafter. Pierre DuPont ran it when Durant was ousted. Pierre DuPont ran it, and then Sloan came in right afterwards. But I think it was 20. If it wasn't, it was early part of 21.
So what about GMI? Do you know when that was started?
Yeah. So I have a radio show that we do. In fact, Andrew has the logo on. It's called Fish and the Flint Chronicles, and it's on. If you go to flintchronicles.com, we have all the old shows, and it's part business and sports and history. We had Dr. Bob McMahon, who's now the president of Kettering University, on, and he was talking about all the old history that they have. And there were several incarnations. There was an incarnation before it was GMI. And I cannot remember the name of it, but it was called something different. But it was right around 1919 when it first opened its doors. Does that sound right? You're shaking your head? Yeah, I think it was 1919 when it opened. Yeah, well, it is on. No, there you go. It is on because they just had the big celebration of it. They took over Atwood Stadium in Flint, and they had a big thing for their 100th anniversary. So yeah, 1919. How about that?
Top is the Industrial Fellowship League Night School,
There you go.
School of Automotive, Institute of Technology, and then GMI.
And then GMI. There you go. And now Kettering University. Yep. Yes, sir. Absolutely.
A guy named Dutch Bauer.
Yeah, Dutch Bauer was one of the really famous engineers in Flint. Not only that, but he was a philanthropist too, and he gave a lot of money to the College and Cultural Center, and they named a theater after him, the Bauer Theater. Very important guy. Dutch Bauer was, along with Enos de Waters, were the heirs to the Walter Marr, Eugene Richard, Arthur Mason triumvirate of engine engineers. Very important guys.
He was my wife's third cousin.
Is that right?
He's from Oil City, Pennsylvania. His name was F.A. Bauer.
Yes.
They called him Dutch.
Yep, that was what he was known as.
From Pennsylvania, and they assumed that Pennsylvania was Dutch. But he was really a German. And how you say, he was Deutsch. He wasn't a Pennsylvania Dutchman, he was a German, but they called him Dutch instead of Deutsch. And he came from a place called Oil City, Pennsylvania. Very, very humble beginning.
And a really, really important guy in the GM story. Yeah, and then when I grew up, I thought he was a theater. I didn't even know he was a guy. That's like a lot of these stories. There's so many things. Interestingly enough, the only thing in Flint named after Durant was a bench. A bench lower than these chairs. Until just a few years ago, when I was a kid, there was Durant Turry-Mott Elementary School. And I only knew the name because we played sports against them. No clue who Durant was. Turry, I thought, was a thing. It was a doctor, as it turns out. And we all knew who Mott was because Mott was the philanthropist. And a bench. And the bench got named only because C.S. Mott came out and insisted that something in the College and Cultural Center be named after Durant. And they went, well, we'll put his name on this bench. And it's there to this day. It's like a 18-inch bench. Now there's not a lot, but there's much more. But if you drive around Flint or you walk down in Flint and you said, who's Billy Durant? You'll get, I think he's a school maybe. Still 9 out of 10 people probably. My goal is maybe we get it to 7 out of 10 people only don't know who he is. But Bauer's another great example of it. Yeah.
You know where his house is?
That I don't know.
6,000 square foot mansion that sits on Parkland.
Parkside Drive. Yeah, that's right.
Every Buick, new Buick from 1910 to 1930, was taken in front of his house.
That I didn't know. But he lived by Harlow Curtis, who was the CEO of General Motors in the 50s, who insisted on living in Flint. He lived on Parkside Drive, right off that, and he took a helicopter to Detroit every day to go to work. But he lived in Flint. And he also lived next to Alfred Summerfield, who was one of Dwight Eisenhower's close friends. It was Eisenhower and Harlow Curtis. I didn't know Bauer lived there as well. That's great. So that's what I love about doing these is inevitably I wind up learning something. It's kind of like a bottomless pit of opportunity as far as learning stuff. That's great. Thank you for that. Now I'm going to drive by the house. Yes, sir.
Gary, in your opening remarks, you mentioned about World War II and the importance of General Motors played.
Yes.
But you didn't mention Bill Newton, and I'm surprised.
Oh, yeah. Knutson, so for those of you that don't know, he was in charge of the entire thing. He had been with Ford, and then he grew unenamored with Mr. Ford and wound up coming to General Motors. And it's interesting that Henry Ford and Alfred Sloan opposed the arsenal of democracy. They didn't want anything to do with it. And Bunky, they called him Bunky Knutson. And Bunky Knutson felt it was his patriotic duty to go work for, I think it was $1 a year. He went to lead the arsenal of democracy in America. And you're right, we really should mention him more frequently because he was the guy. It was his ability to bring lots of different groups together, and especially his knowledge of the auto industry that allowed us to ramp up as quickly as we did. Bunky, I don't know what Bunky's, what's his real first name? What's Bunky's first name? It wasn't Bunky.
Bunky was the son. Bunky was the son. That was Simon.
So who was what was the dad's first name?
Ed.
Was it Ed?
No.
That sounds too pedestrian. William?
Yeah, William.
There you go.
Big Bill.
Big Bill. That's right. Yeah, and Bunky was his son, right? Yeah, Knudsen. If you're googling Knutson. Yeah, really, he led the whole thing and there were lots of. There's a guy named Charles K. Hyde who's a professor from Wayne State University, who I'm not sure if he's still with us or not. I've been trying to locate this guy and I haven't been successful yet. But he wrote a book called Arsenal of Democracy, and he had access to all the archives. And Knutson plays a pretty big role in that story. Yeah, and I always call him Bunky. I got to remember it's Big Bill because that's actually the right the right way to say it. I don't think of him as William, though. But thank you for that. Yeah, really important guy. We should talk about him. Yes, sir.
I believe that Humphrey was the son of Bill Newton.
Right, I think so.
Bill or William Newton was the CEO of GM.
It's like the 60s, maybe.
And I believe really part of the war effort.
Oh, huge part of the war effort. Yeah, that's the. I will say this for the National Museum, the National World War II Museum. They have a great example of what Knutson did. They do have a whole display on that there.
I said I liked Pontiac Motors, but company is no longer as good. But Knutson was sent. Stephen Knutson was vice president in charge of the tech center, and he was sent out to Pontiac. Actually, this would have been 1956, I believe.
56, 57, because he got rid of the streaks on the 57s. The indents were there for the initial photography, and they had to do a quick rejob on the lids to get rid of those indents.
Let me ask this question. With a show of hands, how many people worked for General Motors that are in the room? At one time or another. Yeah, that's cool. That's cool.
It's hard to say, though. Knutson was sent out by the corporation to actually shut down Pontiac Motors.
And what year was that?
This would have been about 1956. 56, 57, someplace in there. But he got out and he looked at Pontiac and what they were doing, and he reported back to the building that this would be a mistake to shut them down. And the end result, Knutson really got Pontiac going again, and the one he really got it going with was when they came out with the 1959 model. And they had already shipped, but back then, Pontiac was famous for that piece of shiny skin down the center of the foot.
Right.
And we had already shipped cars, the 1959 models, to dealers. And this was the first automobile that Knutson really had his hands on to be able to have influence on it. And he said, we want that to eliminate all, and they had to work nights and everything else to build enough hoods to send to the dealers to replace the ones that were there so that silver streak was eliminated.
So we have him to thank for the GTO, too. We wouldn't have had a GTO if we wouldn't have saved Pontiac. That's great. Yes, sir. Question.
That book about Bill Knutson is Freedom's Forge.
Freedom's Forge?
Freedom's Forge. If you haven't read it, it's great.
I will read it. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I will say I'm serious. I was disappointed in the Arsenal of Democracy because all around New Orleans they have these giant banners promoting it. So I was really excited. That was the first place I went, and it's okay. It's not terrible, but it just doesn't do. I mean, I know they're limited, have unlimited space, and they were trying to serve a lot of masters. But stuff like you're talking, there's just they can fix it. They need to fix it. It doesn't do justice to the story, I don't think. But I'm hypercritical of that. Yes, sir.
Are you an Arab or Fisher Body?
Oh, I wish. We'd be doing this talk on my boat in the Caribbean, sir. No, but I will tell you a little bit about Fisher Body. A friend of mine, Scotty Philpott, lived in a gigantic house on the other side of the tracks when I met him when I was in junior high. And this was just an amazing mansion. It's incredible. It's owned by a guy named Steve Hetty now. And I don't know how many rooms it had. And I'd always heard that a lumber baron had built it, but no one ever really could say. It was only a few years ago that I realized the house was built by the W.F. Stewart family, by W.F. Stewart's son, actually. And Stewart was a Canadian who did the bodies for the original Buicks and for General Motors vehicles until they brought Fisher Body in. GM bought the Stewart company, sort of absorbed it like they did with Weston Mott. And then during the Depression, Stewart went out of business, and I think it was the son hung himself in that house. And Fisher Body sort of was the brothers. I think there's 7 maybe Fisher brothers, and they were in charge of it. But no, I do get asked that a lot, and the answer would be, I wish. So, Any other questions? Any other questions at all? Yes, sir.
The Durant heirs right now?
There's not a lot. So part of that story, the humanistic part of the story, is his son Clifford was a party guy who did a lot of drinking, a lot of partying, and he died, I think, of a heart attack in his 40s out in California. And then the daughter, Marjorie, wound up becoming a heroin addict and a heroin dealer, and then killed her husband by knocking him down some stairs. And that was the end of that deal. And so the family, in fact, there was an article in the New York Times, no, it was a Wall Street Journal, about 20 years ago called The Tale of Two Cities, and it was a story of Flint versus Grand Rapids. And it was talking about in Grand Rapids, the Van Andel, DeVos families, the Herman Miller family, and the Steelcase families were instrumental in pumping billions of dollars into the revitalization of downtown Grand Rapids. And it said, whereas in Flint, the heirs to the Buick, Chevrolet, and Durant families are nowhere to be found. Buick died destitute. Chevrolet essentially did as well, as did Durant. He does have some relatives, and they were in Flint not too long ago for the dedication of his statue. I think the closest direct ancestor of Durant's is a rancher, I think out in Montana or Colorado, but don't quote me on that. But it's not the same lineage as you see with the Fords. You know, the winners do write the history. There's one picture of Alfred Sloan welcoming Billy Durant onto a stage when Durant was probably in his 80s. And it's Durant's this kind of, he's a very old guy at the time, and he's coming out to be introduced by Alfred Sloan, who's wearing spats and a very, expensive suit, and being credited with, and don't get me wrong, Sloan was a brilliant guy, and he did an amazing amount of good as it relates to management theory, but he built it all on Durant's back, and to his credit, he did give a fair amount of credit to Durant for having built it. It isn't like the guys ignored him. They did revere what Durant did, and even his enemies respected and liked him, which is an unusual combination. But his kids did not fare very well, unfortunately. Yes, sir?
How did he manage to start a bowling alley when he was destitute and his friends had to send him money?
Yeah. Yeah, so the bankruptcy court didn't catch the briefcase of cash he had, and the Pomeroy Day company was owned by his mom, and it was a warehouse. And so Durant, it's not confirmed, but my suspicion is that Durant was able to coerce certain investors into being a part of the deal, and everyone that knew him at the time talked about his briefcase that had cash in it. So I'm going to just take a while. And he also did there was a period of years where he went around to a lot of these big hitters that he knew, including Mr. Mott, and got them to give him money for everything from Cinnabar mine to all battery company. I mean, it's like I think of it this way. I think in life you have X number of opportunities to do amazing stuff. Look at songwriters, a lot of songwriters, very few are good for 50, 60 years, right? I mean, all the people that are touring around right now, a lot of them are singing their old songs. And I think Durant he'd played it out, but he still had that last bit of vision for it. But no, like the cars and even like the Frigidaire, people didn't think that really was going. They thought it was just him trying to come up with ideas. And I don't think it took a lot of money to do it, but it took some money, and I'm guessing that not all of it was his. That's my suspicion. Had to be, because it was, by all accounts, a really nice place. And I guess it had something to do with the briefcase full of cash. What else? Anything else on any of the guys, any of the stuff that we talked about at all? All right. Well, thank you very, very much. If you have questions, come up and chat. I'll stick around. Thank you very, very much.